Your daughter is whispering to the janitor." The words stopped Reagan Moore in her tracks. She was halfway through a curt nod to the school receptionist when the sentence landed casual offhand but sharp enough to split the air like glass. She turned her heels, clicking once on the polished tile floor. "What did you just say?" The young woman behind the front desk blinked. I mean, we weren't sure at first. Ivy usually doesn't talk right. But she said something. To Mr. Blake. Reagan's eyes narrowed. Mr. Blake? Who? The receptionist leaned closer. The janitor. The halls of Bellhurst Academy gleamed under soft amber lighting. Everything about the place screamed money-generational old and quiet. Reagan moved through it like a Force-Heel's steady trench coat swinging with each determined step. She wasn't here to be charmed. She was here to pick up Ivy and get back to the office before the next client call. But now, her daughter, her selectively mute daughter, was apparently whispering to the janitor. She stopped outside classroom 2B and looked through the narrow glass window. There she was, Ivy, 7 years old, pale blue dress, blonde curls tucked behind one ear, sitting cross-legged on a reading mat, and leaning slightly toward a tall man in gray overalls who was crouched beside her. Reagan opened the door just enough to hear. "See you tomorrow," the girl said softly, and the janitor smiled, not indulgently, not with surprise, but with a kind of gentle certainty. "I'll be right here." Reagan stood frozen. She hadn't heard Ivy speak in almost a year. Not to her, not to teachers, not to therapists who charged more per hour than her own legal counsel. But now, just like that, her daughter was chatting with a janitor. She pushed open the door fully. "Ivy, get your things. We're leaving." The girl startled, then rose quickly, grabbing her little backpack and clutching the strap. The janitor, tall, maybe late 30s or early 40s, brown hair slightly messy, hands rough with work, stood too. He didn't smile, just offered a small, respectful nod. "You must be her mother," he said. Reagan's gaze was ice. "And you're the janitor who thinks he's a speech therapist." A flicker passed over his eyes, pain, maybe, or weariness, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "I don't think anything, ma'am. I was just listening." "Well," she said crisply, "I'd appreciate it if next time you left the listening to professionals." Ivy tugged lightly at her mother's coat. "Mom!" Reagan's heart jumped. That whisper, it was Ivy's. Again. But she didn't let it show. She didn't have time for emotion. Not here, not now. We're leaving. They walked in silence through the parking lot. Ivy's small footsteps tried to match Reagan's long, purposeful strides. Reagan unlocked the luxury sedan with a beep, and Ivy climbed in without a word. She started the engine but didn't pull out. Her hand gripped the steering wheel too tight. Her daughter had spoken, twice, to a stranger, and Reagan had no idea why. Later that night, as the kitchen of her minimalist condo overlooking the city, Reagan poured a glass of red wine and opened her laptop. Her fingers hovered over the keys before typing Gabriel Blake Bellhurst Academy. Staff. The school website didn't have much. No photo, just a name under facilities. She narrowed her search. Her legal instincts kicked in. Gabriel Blake Therapist, New York. One link stood out. An old medical journal. Innovative Approaches to Selective Mutism Case Study by Gabriel Blake, M.S. CCCSLP. Her eyes scanned it. He'd once been a licensed speech-language pathologist, specialized in pediatric trauma, multiple awards, papers published, then 4 years ago. Nothing. License inactive. No known practice. No obituary, no scandal. He had just disappeared, and now he mopped floors at Ivy's school. The next morning, Reagan didn't go to the office. She arrived at Bellhurst just before lunch and asked for Mr. Blake. He was in the courtyard kneeling beside a water fountain with a wrench in hand. "Mr. Blake," she called. He stood wiping his hands on a rag. "Ms. Moore." "I looked you up," she said bluntly. "You were a speech therapist. A good one, apparently. Why are you scrubbing fountains at a prep school? He didn't flinch. I like quiet places. That's not an answer. He gave a soft breath of a laugh. Maybe I've given all the answers I had. Now I just listen. She crossed her arms. Listen, Mr. Blake, Gabe. What? My name's Gabe. There was something deeply steady in his tone. No arrogance. No agenda. Just grounded. She hated how much that disarmed her. She pressed on. Did you know my daughter hadn't spoken to anyone in nearly a year? I figured he said. But she hummed near the music room. Barely audible. So I sat there fixing a loose tile. Didn't say a word. Next day, she sat closer, and one day she said, "Do you like stories?" Reagan blinked. She started with that she asked barely above a whisper. He nodded, and I said yes. There was a long pause between them. Then Gabe added quietly, "Sometimes kids don't stop speaking because they're broken. They stop because no one's really listening." Reagan clenched her jaw. "You have no idea what she's been through." "You're right," he said, meeting her eyes. "But I know what silence sounds like when it's not a choice." Reagan stood there unsure whether to argue or cry. Instead, she turned. Stay away from her. But, even as she walked off, her daughter's voice, so soft, so real, echoed in her memory. "See you tomorrow." And for the first time in a long time, Reagan wasn't sure whether she was walking away from trouble or from a miracle. The bell rang through the corridors of Bellhurst Academy, crisp, chime-like, but sterile in its precision. Gabe Blake remained crouched beside the same water fountain, watching as sneakers, loafers, and polished flats rushed past him in waves. None of the students noticed the janitor with the wrench. Except one. Ivy. She lingered just a second longer near the hallway corner, half hidden by a marble column. Her eyes, curious, alert, unsure, met his. She didn't wave, didn't speak, but she nodded. Slight, almost imperceptible. Gabe smiled back, then returned to tightening the loose fixture. He didn't need words. He'd once built an entire life listening for things most people ignored: the tremble in a breath, the pause between syllables, the flicker in a child's eyes before they turned away. It was all still there. His ears hadn't forgotten. He just no longer used them in a clinic. He used them here, among whispers, creaks, and silence. Gabe, the voice behind him, was firm, clipped. Reagan Moore. He rose slowly. Ms. Moore. She stood under the arched doorway like she owned the stonework itself, flawless navy suit, arms folded, jaw tight. But her eyes betrayed the night she'd had. Too little sleep, too many questions. "I need to talk," she said, privately. He gestured to the courtyard bench. "Over there." "No," she said flatly. "Someplace with a door." Gabe led her down the hall past students filing into lunch into a small, unused staff room that smelled faintly of old wood polish and forgotten chalk. He pulled the door closed behind them. Reagan didn't sit. "I want to understand something," she said, pacing slightly. "My daughter has refused every professional I've hired. Top therapists, world-class clinics, nothing. And then, out of nowhere, she starts talking to you, a janitor." Gabe raised an eyebrow. "You say janitor like it's a diagnosis. I say it like it's not your profession." He didn't react, just nodded. Fair. She waited. Expected more. An apology, a justification, anything. But he just stood there. Calm. Still. "Ivy doesn't talk," she continued, her voice sharpening, "because she saw me break down during the divorce. Because I screamed and cried and slammed doors I swore I never would. She saw her father walk out. She heard me beg him to stay. And the next morning—" She stopped speaking. Silence filled the room like water rising in a glass. Gabe finally spoke. "That's not your fault." Reagan snapped. "Don't patronize me." "I'm not," he said softly. "But you're trying to fix her like she's broken. She's not. She's protecting herself." Her hands clenched. "So, what do I do?" "Just wait for her to say something to me. Hope she'll forgive me enough to speak again." Gabe looked at her carefully, then said, What if she's waiting for you to stop talking and just hear her? Reagan blinked. It was such a simple sentence, but it hit like a verdict. He wasn't trying to win, or insult, or teach. He was just telling the truth. She sat down. For the first time since Ivy went silent, she allowed herself to collapse just a little. I don't know how to do that, she admitted, quieter now. I talk for a living. I command rooms, cross-examine liars. I'm not gentle. Gabe pulled out a chair and sat across from her, elbows on his knees. You don't have to be gentle, just present. Reagan stared at the floor. Why did you stop practicing? She asked, not looking at him. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. My wife. She looked up. She was a singer. Jazz. The kind of voice that makes you close your eyes to listen better. We found a lump on her throat 2 weeks after our wedding. By the time we caught it, the damage was done. Reagan said nothing. She lost her voice, he continued. I tried everything. Therapy, experimental treatments, silent singing techniques, you name it. But eventually, I realized I wasn't helping her heal. I was just trying not to lose her. And did you? He nodded. Cancer didn't take her. Silence did. The room was unbearably quiet now. I'm sorry, Reagan whispered. Gabe gave a half smile. You're not the only one who blamed herself for someone else's silence. A beat passed. Is that why you work here? She asked. To be close to what you lost. He looked out the small window. I came here to disappear, but then Ivy sat next to me one day while I was fixing a heater, didn't say a word, just listened. Next day she brought a book, pointed to a sentence, then another, then she whispered, Do you like stories? Reagan's voice caught. That was her first line to you. He nodded. She hasn't said that to anyone since she was 4. Gabe met her eyes. It wasn't for me. It was her way of asking, Will you sit with me in this silence? And I did. Reagan stood slowly. There were no courtrooms here. No cross-examinations. Just 2 people sitting in a dusty room trying to stitch together something they both once lost. Before she left, she asked Will, You keep talking to her? Gabe smiled gently. Only if she wants me to. Later that evening, Ivy sat on her bed knees, tucked up to her chest, crayon in hand. Reagan knocked softly and stepped inside. She didn't ask questions. She didn't say sorry. She just sat down beside her daughter and said, Do you like stories? Ivy looked up, her lips parting just slightly, and for the first time in months, she reached out and held her mother's hand. The next morning, Reagan Moore walked into her downtown office in a tailored gray suit and a head full of noise. Usually, her mind was a courtroom. Disciplined, compartmentalized, efficient. But today it was a messy drawer. Every time she tried to file away yesterday's conversation with Gabe Blake, a memory slipped out. Ivy's whisper. Gabe's eyes. That quiet sentence, silence, didn't break her. It protected her. She couldn't unhear it. She pushed open her office door, but before she could sit, her assistant, Jenna, peeked in. Morning, Ms. Moore. Your 9 o'clock deposition just canceled. Shall I move up the Coleman consult? Reagan shook her head. No, leave it. I need 30 minutes. Alone. She sat at her desk and stared at the screen. A blank search bar. Just blinking. Then slowly, she typed Gabriel Blake, licensed speech pathologist, NY. Dozens of results. News articles, testimonials, even a conference video from 6 years ago. She clicked it. The image froze on a younger, Gabe, clean-shaven, black blazer posture, confident. The caption read, Restoring Lost Voices. Rewiring Silence After Trauma. But what stopped her wasn't the presentation. It was the quote pinned under the video, apparently something he'd said during Q&A. When a child stops speaking, don't ask what's wrong with them. Ask what the silence is trying to say. Reagan leaned back, eyes stinging. She didn't know whether she wanted to thank him or punch a wall. Later that day, she made a quiet call to Bellhurst. Miss Moore, the receptionist, answered. Ivy's doing fine. No incidents today. That's not why I'm calling. I'd like access to Mr. Blake's employment file. A pause. I'm not sure if that's allowed. I'm on the school's legal board. Reagan lied smoothly. It's a compliance matter. 10 minutes later, a redacted PDF landed in her inbox. She opened it, and there it was. Gabriel Elias Blake, D.O.B., July 14, 1983. Former occupation licensed speech-language pathologist, education, Columbia University, M.S., in Communication Sciences and Disorders. Employment termination, voluntary resignation, Mount Sinai Children's Hospital, reason for departure, personal bereavement. No incident report. Reagan scrolled to the references. The last listed Madeline Blake, former patient and spouse, deceased. Her heart dropped. There was no disciplinary action, no scandal, no accusation. He had simply walked away. That night, Reagan made grilled cheese sandwiches, the one food Ivy always finished. They ate in front of the living room window overlooking the city skyline like a row of watchful giants. Ivy nibbled quietly. Her eyes never left the lights. "Did you like your book group today?" Reagan asked. Ivy nodded. "Did Mr. Blake say anything funny again?" Pause. Then softly, he said, "Silence is like a blanket, but you still get cold if no one's under it with you." Reagan froze. She looked at her daughter, not just the delicate features or the shadow of a girl too wise for her age, but really saw her. "You think he's right?" she asked. Ivy turned. "I think he doesn't talk to fill the quiet. He just sits in it. That's nicer." Reagan's voice cracked before she could stop it. "I wish I had done that." Ivy leaned gently against her shoulder. The following day, Reagan returned to Bellhurst unannounced. She found Gabe in the supply closet organizing mop heads like a surgeon lining up instruments. "You keep surprising me," he said without looking up, "and you keep showing up in my daughter's words," she replied. "So, I guess we're even." He smiled faintly. "Is this another interrogation?" She held up her phone. "No. This time I did my homework." He straightened. "You read my file." "I did. A beat. Then you know," he said. "I do," she replied. "I know you lost her. I know you stopped practicing. And I know you didn't stop listening." He leaned against the shelf. "That's all I could keep doing." Reagan exhaled. "You said something once, that silence isn't brokenness, it's protection." "Yes." She looked away. "You were talking about Ivy, but you were also talking about yourself, weren't you?" Gabe's silence was answer enough. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "For your wife. For what I said. For assuming you were just a janitor." He offered no bitterness in his voice. She nodded. "You weren't wrong," he said. "I am a janitor, and it's the first job where no one expects me to fix something I can't." Reagan stepped closer. "But you are fixing something," she whispered. "Not just Ivy. Maybe me too." He studied her. Ivy didn't need fixing. She needed someone who remembered what it's like to lose their voice. Reagan swallowed the lump in her throat. "And you?" she asked. "What did you need?" He hesitated. "Then I needed to matter, without saving anyone." The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was safe. Then Gabe added softly, almost to himself, "You know what the last thing my wife wrote to me was?" Reagan shook her head. "You hear what others miss. Don't let grief make you go deaf." He looked up, eyes shining, but dry. "And for a while." "I did." Reagan stepped back carefully, choosing her words. "Would you ever consider doing it again?" she asked. "Therapy. For Ivy. For others. For you." "I'm not licensed anymore," he said. "Then do it for free," she challenged. "Do it for the ones who whisper. The ones like her." He studied her for a long, thoughtful moment, and then, quietly, "Only if someone sits with me this time," she smiled. "I'm here." And for the first time, so was he. Ivy's fingers danced across the keys of the old upright piano in the school's music room. She wasn't playing a song exactly, more like tracing a memory. Her tiny hands searched for a tune that only lived in her mind, pressing one hesitant note at a time. Outside the door, Gabe stood silently with his mop, letting the melody wrap around him like a half-remembered lullaby. He didn't enter, didn't interrupt. He just listened. Reagan sat in her car in front of Bellhurst engine, idling. She wasn't supposed to be here today. She had a full docket. But something about the way Ivy had looked at her last night, the way her small fingers gripped Reagan's hand and didn't let go. She couldn't forget it. He doesn't talk to fill the quiet. He just sits in it. Those words haunted her. She got out of the car. Inside the school, she found Gabe in the hallway, dustpan in hand, standing outside the music room. "She's inside?" Reagan asked. He nodded. "Third afternoon in a row." Reagan glanced toward the door. "What is she playing?" He gave a faint smile. "Not sure, but it sounds like her." Reagan folded her arms, trying to hide the lump rising in her throat. "I never taught her to play. We used to have a keyboard at home, but it mostly collected dust." "She's not playing with her hands," Gabe said. "She's remembering with her heart." That stopped her. "I'm not sure I know how to do that," she admitted. Gabe turned to her. "You will. Most people wait for children to perform. Ivy's just asking to be heard." Minutes later, Ivy emerged, clutching a small folder of sheet music. She stopped when she saw her mother. "You came," she whispered. Reagan knelt down. "Of course I did." Ivy looked over her shoulder at Gabe, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Can we go to the park?" she asked. "The one with the lake." Reagan blinked in surprise. Ivy hadn't asked to go anywhere in almost a year. "We can," she said softly. "Right now." The lake shimmered with late afternoon sunlight. Ducks glided by, unconcerned with the weight of human silence. Reagan sat on the bench beside Ivy, unsure of what to say, but Ivy broke the stillness. "Why did you stop listening to music?" Reagan turned to her. "What do you mean?" "After Daddy left," Ivy said, "the house got so quiet, but not the kind you like." Reagan exhaled. "I didn't want to hear songs that reminded me of who we used to be." Ivy looked down. "I thought maybe it was because of me." Reagan's breath caught. "No," she said, firmly cupping her daughter's cheek. "Sweetheart, it was never you. I was trying to be strong. I thought silence meant I was holding it together." Ivy leaned against her. "But sometimes it felt like you disappeared with him." Reagan closed her eyes, the truth hitting harder than any courtroom cross. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to leave you in the quiet." That night, Reagan found an old box in the hallway closet. Inside, sheet music, a dusty Bluetooth speaker, and the one thing she hadn't touched since the divorce, an old music box. It had belonged to Ivy's grandmother. She wound it slowly. The soft melody trickled out, fragile, high-pitched, imperfect. But beautiful. Ivy came running from her room. "That's it. What is—" "That's what I was trying to play. On the piano." Reagan stared at her. "You remembered that it played during bedtime stories, before everything got quiet." Reagan knelt down, tears stinging her eyes. "I didn't know you still remembered that sound." Ivy looked at her mother for a long, quiet moment. "I remember everything." The next morning, Reagan knocked on the staff lounge door at Bellhurst. Gabe looked up from fixing a broken chair. "I need a favor," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Is this going to get you in trouble?" "Probably." "Then I'm listening." They sat together in the small, forgotten music room that afternoon, just Reagan, Gabe, and Ivy. No forms, no therapists, no walls. Ivy placed the music box on top of the piano. "I want to learn the whole song," she said, "so I can play it right." Gabe smiled. "We can do that." He sat beside her, pointing to the keys gently. "Each note is like a word. You don't have to rush it. Just feel it." Reagan sat on a nearby bench, quietly watching. For once, she didn't take notes, didn't analyze. She just listened, and something inside her began to exhale. Later, as they walked back toward the school parking lot, Reagan broke the silence. "I want to ask you something," she said to Gabe. "Sure. If this what you're doing with Ivy, if this were therapy, would you charge me?" He looked at her with kind amusement. "No." "Good," she said. "Because I'd rather call it something else." "What would you call it?" She stopped walking and looked him in the eye. Redemption. That night, Ivy fell asleep to the sound of the music box playing again, soft and sweet. And, for the first time, in a very long time, Reagan let it keep playing long after the child had drifted to dreams. The courtroom was packed with tension, the kind you could feel in your teeth. Reagan stood at the center, sharp as a blade, delivering closing arguments in a high-profile custody case. Her voice was firm, precise, unshakable. Her tone held no trace of the woman who just a week earlier had sat beside a lake with her daughter apologizing for the silence in their home. But something in her eyes had changed. Every word she delivered now came not just from strategy but from somewhere deeper, somewhere that had been cracked open. She won the case, of course. But the victory didn't feel like it used to. Later that evening, Gabe was repairing a broken bookshelf in the school library when he heard footsteps behind him. "I know this is where you disappear," Reagan said softly. He looked over his shoulder. "You tracked me down in the quietest room on campus. That's a new record." She smiled faintly, stepping closer. "I came to ask you a question." He nodded for her to continue. "When you sit with her when Ivy plays piano or talks to you or just exists, what do you see?" Gabe thought for a long moment before answering. "I see a girl trying to find the shape of her voice again, and I see her mother standing just outside that shape, afraid she might break it." Reagan's breath hitched. "I don't know how to be what she needs." "You don't have to be everything," he said gently. "You just have to be there, and not leave when she finally lets you in." They sat down at the reading table. Reagan looked around at the shelves, the smell of old paper and floor wax filling the air. "This school, these kids, they have no idea who you used to be." Gabe shrugged. "That's the point. But it's not who you are." He looked up. "It's who I became." She leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You're still saving lives, Gabe. You just swapped degrees for mops." "I'm not saving anyone," he said quietly. "Just making space for healing. There's a difference." Silence settled between them. Then Reagan asked, "Do you miss your old life?" "Every day," he said without hesitation, "but not the way people think. I don't miss the conferences or the awards. I miss the moment a kid finds their voice for the first time, the way their eyes light up not because they said something but because they chose to." Reagan swallowed hard. "Ivy never chose to speak to me again." "That's not true," Gabe said. "She just didn't use words." A moment passed. Then Reagan asked quietly, "What about you? When was the last time someone listened to you?" Gabe smiled, but it was tinged with something aching. "Before she got sick." Reagan met his gaze. "Then maybe it's time someone did." The next day, Gabe found a small package outside his custodial closet. No note. Inside was a second-hand copy of The Velveteen Rabbit, its spine-worn pages slightly yellowed. Tucked inside the front cover was a sticky note. "Because real things can't be ugly. They're just loved differently. Ivy told me this last night. Thought you should know. R." He stared at it for a long time. He hadn't read that story since his wife was alive. She used to cry at the line, "Once you are real, you can't become unreal again. It lasts for always." That night, Gabe sat in his small apartment holding the book. The city buzzed outside, but inside it was still. He flipped through the pages slowly, one by one, like peeling open parts of himself he'd buried. And then, when he reached the last page, he whispered to no one, "I don't want to be invisible anymore." At Bellhurst the next morning, Ivy sat quietly in the piano room, her fingers hovering over the keys. Reagan watched from the doorway unnoticed. "I forget the middle part," Ivy mumbled, eyes on the sheet music. Gabe sat beside her. "Then skip it. Play the part you remember." "But it won't be perfect," she said. Gabe smiled. "Sweetheart music isn't made of perfection. It's made of feeling. And right now, your heart knows more than your fingers." Reagan's throat tightened. She'd spent years trying to perfect every line, every answer, every defense in life. But here was this man telling her daughter it was okay to be incomplete and still worthy of sound. Ivy began to play. Rough, hesitant, but with a kind of hope that made Reagan's eyes sting. And suddenly, Gabe looked toward the doorway. He saw her. Reagan didn't move, but Gabe gave the tiniest nod an invitation. And this time, she didn't walk away. When the music ended, Ivy looked up. Was that okay? Gabe leaned in and said something Reagan could barely hear. That wasn't okay. That was real. As they left the school, Reagan turned to him and said, "You didn't just fix her silence. You taught me how to sit in mine." He glanced at her. "Do you know how rare that is, what for someone like you to pause and listen?" She smiled. "I'm trying." Gabe nodded. "That's all it takes." And for the first time in a very long time, the walls between them didn't feel so high anymore. The room buzzed with low murmurs, the kind laced with suspicion. Bellhurst's parent advisory board sat around a long, polished table in the library, each holding paper agendas but clearly more interested in something off script. Reagan knew the look, half concern, half condescension. She'd worn it herself in courtrooms. At the head of the table sat Mrs. Callahan, the board chair. Perfect posture, pearl necklace, the subtle tone of practiced authority. Reagan didn't flinch. She was used to battlefields that dressed themselves in polite manners and subtle judgment. But this wasn't about her reputation. This was about Ivy and Gabe. "We've received several concerns." Callahan began, her voice smooth but cutting. "Unorthodox behavior, unsupervised time between students and custodial staff." "You mean, Gabe?" Blake Reagan interrupted. A pause. "Yes," Callahan replied carefully. "Mr. Blake." Reagan folded her arms. "Is there a complaint from my daughter?" "No, but—" "From her teacher, from the principal, from anyone who actually knows what's happening." The room fell uncomfortably quiet. A man near the end of the table, a dentist or hedge fund manager. Reagan didn't care, cleared his throat. "It's not personal." "Ms. Moore, it's about image. Optics. This school has standards." Reagan leaned forward, her tone flat and lethal. "Then let me tell you what I see. A man who helped my daughter find her voice when professionals couldn't. A janitor who never asked for credit or money or attention. Just a place to stand still long enough for a child to feel safe." Callahan sighed. "And yet, it's untraditional. The board has to consider potential risks." Reagan's lips curved into a cold smile. "You want risk. Try being a mother watching your daughter go silent and knowing every expert has failed. Try being her and feeling like no one's listening. That is risk. And you want to remove the one person who finally did something about it because of optics." No one spoke, and then the door opened. A secretary leaned in and whispered something to Callahan. She frowned. "There's been an incident in the common area. 2 students had a disagreement." Reagan stood instantly. "Is it Ivy? I believe so." The hallway was chaos. Students stood frozen in place, whispering. A few teachers hurried by while one security guard held back the crowd. Reagan's pulse hammered in her throat as she reached the glass-walled commons. And there, she saw her Ivy, standing beside another girl slightly older who was holding her cheek. Ivy's hands were clenched, her face pale. But what froze Reagan wasn't the scene. It was the sound, her daughter's voice. "I said, stop," Ivy was saying. Loud, clear, shaking. She pushed my book off the table. I asked her to stop 3 times. She didn't. The girl beside her looked stunned. It was just a joke. She knew it wasn't. Ivy snapped. She knew I hate it when people touch my things without asking. The principal stepped forward, but before he could speak, Reagan was already inside. She didn't rush. She didn't cry. She crouched beside Ivy, gently placing her hand on her shoulder. "I heard you," Reagan said. Every word. Ivy's eyes brimmed with something raw and unfamiliar power. Not aggression, not rebellion, but the power of a child who had just chosen to speak and refused to be silenced again. She didn't listen, Ivy whispered. So I made her hear me. Reagan pulled her into a hug. "I'm proud of you." Back in the conference room, Callahan cleared her throat. "I believe this changes things." "No," Reagan said, rising to her feet. This reveals things. Ivy didn't just speak, she advocated. Because someone gave her permission to believe her words were worth hearing. She turned to the board. If you remove Gabe Blake, you won't just silence a janitor. You'll silence every kid like Ivy who finally believes they matter. So make your choice. But do it knowing who you're choosing not to listen to. She left before they could reply. Later that evening, Reagan stood outside the janitor's closet. The hallway was empty, quiet. She knocked once. Gabe opened the door. Shirt rolled to the elbows, hair tousled a pencil behind his ear. "I heard," he said softly. "You always do," she replied. She spoke. She roared. Reagan said, eyes shimmering. He chuckled, a sound she realized she hadn't heard enough. She used her voice, she added, and she didn't use it to sing or whisper or please anyone. She used it to draw a line. Gabe leaned against the doorframe. "That's the most powerful use of language when it protects." Reagan looked at him. Really looked. And then without warning, she stepped closer. "I think you've spent so long helping others be heard. You forgot you have something to say too." He blinked. "Like what? Like how you feel? About this place? About her? About me?" A beat. Then Gabe said softly, "I feel like I've been standing in a hallway between the past and the future. And today, for the first time, I didn't want to go back." Reagan's voice dropped. "Then don't." In Ivy's room that night, the music box played softly. She curled up in bed, crayon in hand, drawing something in the corner of her notebook. Reagan peeked in. "Can I see?" Ivy turned the notebook around. It was a picture. 3 people. A bench. A music box in the middle. And above them, in shaky handwriting, "Thank you for hearing me." Reagan kissed her forehead and whispered, "Always." And for the first time, Ivy smiled in her sleep. Rain drummed softly against the windows of Reagan's office, streaking down the glass like fingers trying to trace their way inside. The storm rolled over the city in waves, but it couldn't touch the silence that had wrapped itself around her like a second skin. She sat at her desk, and the lights dimmed the documents untouched. Her phone buzzed twice. Text from a senior partner. "Need your input before the Simmons deposition. They're waiting." She didn't reply. Instead, she stared at the framed photo on her bookshelf. Ivy, age 4, laughing wide open. That was before. Before the silence. Before the divorce. Before Reagan built her walls so high that even her daughter's voice couldn't climb over them. But something inside her had shifted. And today she wasn't sure how to shift back. In court, the Simmons deposition was brutal. Not because it was legally complicated, Reagan could dismantle a hostile witness in her sleep, but because she didn't feel anything. She heard her own voice cross-examining her tone, cutting her cadence perfect. But it felt like watching someone else perform a play she no longer believed in. Objection, Your Honor. Irrelevant. Sustained. It all moved like clockwork. And yet something cracked when the opposing counsel leaned forward and said, "Ms. Moore, you seem distracted today." The room shifted. She steadied her voice. Distracted attorneys still win. Let's proceed. But inside, she was already somewhere else. That evening, Reagan stood in her kitchen, untouched wine glass in hand, watching the city blink through the rain. She had no appetite. Not for food, not for words. She barely noticed when the front door opened. Mom Ivy's voice echoed gently, "I'm home." Reagan turned, startled. "You're early. Mr. Gabe walked me. He stayed downstairs." Reagan nodded, crouching to help Ivy take off her soaked rain boots. Then Ivy asked, "Why are you sad?" Reagan paused. "I'm not sad, honey. Just tired." Ivy tilted her head. "But your voice sounds like it's hiding." Reagan blinked. "What do you mean?" "It's like when I used to whisper, not because I couldn't speak, but because I was afraid of how it would sound." The words hit like thunder in a quiet room. Reagan sat down, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't try to be strong. "I think," she said slowly, "I've spent so long talking that I forgot how to say the things that really matter." Ivy leaned her head on her mother's shoulder. "It's okay," she said softly. "Mr. Gabe says grown-ups forget sometimes. But voices aren't lost, just waiting. The next morning, Reagan didn't go to the office. Instead, she walked through the quiet halls of Bellhurst, a visitor badge clipped to her coat. She stopped by the old music room where Gabe was helping Ivy adjust her fingers on the keys. Reagan stayed by the door. Gabe looked up. Their eyes met. She didn't speak. She just held up a small, folded note. He walked over and took it, opening it slowly. Inside, in her handwriting, "Do you want to get coffee with someone who's finally learning how to listen?" He looked up. "I thought you drank espresso," he teased gently. "I've downgraded," she replied. "I'm trying to be less sharp." He smiled. "You're not sharp, Reagan. You're just armored." She laughed quietly. "That's not a compliment." "It is," he said, "because armor can be removed. Stone can't." They met that evening at a small cafe tucked into a side street near the park. No courtroom rhythm, no pretense. Just two people out of their uniforms trying to remember who they were before the world taught them to protect everything. Reagan sipped her drink. "This is strange. What is talking? Without an agenda?" Gabe smiled. "That's how you know it matters." She looked at him. "I used to think words were weapons. Now I'm wondering if they were actually bridges. And I just never crossed them." He stirred his coffee. "My wife once said the most powerful part of a conversation isn't the sentence, it's the silence between them." Reagan leaned in. "You miss her?" "Every day," he said simply. "But I don't live in the missing anymore. I live in the remembering." A beat of silence. "Do you think," Reagan asked cautiously, "that someone like me can be forgiven for not listening sooner?" Gabe's voice was gentle. "Forgiveness isn't earned. It's offered. And from what I've seen, Ivy already gave it to you." Reagan's eyes shimmered. "But I haven't forgiven myself." Then, maybe, he said softly, "You need to hear your own voice. The one you buried under all the right answers." As they walked out, the air smelled like rain-soaked earth. The streets were quiet, and for once Reagan didn't feel like filling the silence. Until Gabe said, "You're doing it." She looked up. Doing what? Letting yourself be heard even without speaking. And in that moment, Reagan Moore, the woman who built a life on perfect arguments, realized that vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was the bravest kind of truth. And finally, she was ready to live in it. The sky outside Bellhurst was unusually soft that morning, clouded but warm, like the world itself had taken a breath and finally decided not to rush. Inside the library, Ivy sat at a corner table, legs tucked beneath her, a yellow pencil pressed thoughtfully between her fingers. All around her, students whispered, pages turned, keys clicked. But Ivy was still anchored in thought. A single blank sheet sat before her, at the top. "Who is your hero?" Reagan arrived early that afternoon, earlier than usual. She'd taken the rest of the week off for the first time in, well, longer than she could remember. Her heels didn't click with authority this time. They moved gently, steadily, as if the woman who wore them had finally let herself slow down. Gabe met her near the entrance. "She's in the library," he said before she asked. Reagan gave a faint smile. "Of course she is." "I think she's writing something important," Gabe added. "She always is," Reagan said softly. Then, before she could walk away, he gently reached out his fingers, brushing the edge of her sleeve. "She watches you, you know," he said, "when you're not looking." Reagan turned. "What do you mean, I mean?" "When you walk in, she straightens her back. She sits taller. She wants to be worthy of being seen by you." Reagan's throat tightened. "I never meant to make her feel that way. I know Gabe said, but sometimes, even love wears armor." Reagan swallowed. "And now," Gabe said, eyes warm, "she's finally writing without it." Back in the library, Ivy looked up as her mother approached. "Can I sit?" Reagan asked. Ivy nodded, then hesitated. "But don't read it yet." "Of course not," Reagan said, folding her hands in her lap. "I'll just sit with you." Ivy smiled. It was small, but it was there. They sat together for 10 quiet minutes, Reagan watching her daughter's pencil dance, pausing sometimes, then returning to the page. Finally, Ivy exhaled. "Done. Do you want me to read it now?" Reagan asked. Ivy shook her head. "I want Mr. Gabe to read it first." They found him in this music room tuning an old violin for the spring recital. Ivy handed him the folded paper without a word. He accepted it like it was made of glass. Then slowly he read, "My hero is Mr. Gabe. He doesn't wear a cape or fix things with tools. He fixes them by listening. He listened to me when no one else could hear me. He never asked me to be louder, just honest. He showed me that silence isn't scary and that talking isn't about being right. It's about being real. He's my hero because he never tried to rescue me. He just stayed close. Until I rescued myself." The room was completely still. Gabe folded the paper carefully, his voice thick with emotion. "May I keep this?" Ivy nodded. "It's yours." Reagan looked at her daughter, tears brimming. "You didn't even mention me." Ivy turned startled. "Mom, you're not my hero." Reagan blinked, wounded but trying not to show it. "You're my home," Ivy said simply. "Heroes come and go. But home, that's forever." Reagan couldn't speak. She just reached forward and pulled her daughter close. Later that evening, Reagan found herself on her own balcony holding a cup of chamomile tea she hadn't touched. The city pulsed gently in the distance. Her phone buzzed. Text from Gabe. "I haven't stopped reading it." She smiled. After a moment, she typed back, "She wrote about you, but she healed because of us." A reply came quickly. "Then let's keep writing with her." Reagan stared at the words. They weren't poetic, not dramatic, but they were steady, like a promise that didn't need grand declarations, just presence. That weekend, Reagan and Ivy walked through the park hand in hand. Spring had begun to show its colors, little buds of green lining the edges of trees, a few daffodils daring to bloom. Reagan stopped beside a bench and pointed. "Isn't this the one?" Ivy nodded. "Where we talked after piano." Reagan sat down. "You know, I still think about that day. I do too." "Do you remember what you said to me?" Ivy nodded again. "I said you came back." Reagan looked at her. "And I meant it. I chose to." Ivy reached into her small backpack and pulled out a folded paper. "This is for you," she said. "It's not an assignment." Reagan unfolded it. It was a drawing, a bench, 2 women, one big, one small, holding hands, and between them, a small, open music box. Notes floated out of it, but instead of musical notes, they were shaped like hearts. Above it, Ivy had written, "Love doesn't always sound like a song. Sometimes it sounds like someone who stayed." Reagan's tears came quietly, not with sobs, but with the kind of silence that holds more love than any words can. And somewhere not far from that bench, a man named Gabe Blake sat on his porch with a worn sheet of notebook paper folded neatly in his jacket pocket. Because once a little girl who had forgotten how to speak chose to write instead. And in doing so, she reminded everyone around her that sometimes the bravest stories aren't shouted, they're shared. The forecast had promised only light drizzle, but by early evening the city was drenched. Rain fell in heavy sheets across the Bellhurst campus, soaking sidewalks and darkening the bricks. Most families had already picked up their children and rushed home. But Reagan stood under the covered walkway, waiting. Her umbrella dangled unused at her side. She wasn't rushing. She was thinking. And somewhere deep inside, she was also waiting for something that hadn't yet been spoken. Ivy came running across the courtyard, her backpack bouncing behind her shoes, splashing through puddles. She paused under the archway and looked up at her mother, panting. "You forgot your umbrella," Reagan said, half smiling. "I wanted to feel the rain," Ivy replied simply. Reagan tucked a strand of damp hair behind her daughter's ear. "Ready to go?" Ivy didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked Mom, "Are you happy?" The question stopped Reagan like a stone to the chest. She blinked. What Ivy looked up at her. "Are you happy?" When you're not pretending. They sat in the car a moment later, neither speaking, the windshield wipers ticking slowly like a metronome. Reagan gripped the steering wheel but didn't start the engine. Happy, she didn't know how to answer. The courtroom queen, the schedule. Warrior would have offered a smooth line, a confident deflection. But now, she had no script. Finally, she turned to Ivy and said, "I think I've spent so much time protecting you I forgot to ask what makes either of us feel safe." Ivy tilted her head. "So?" "That's a no," Reagan exhaled. "That's an almost." Instead of driving home, Reagan turned down a side street. 15 minutes later, they pulled into a familiar parking lot. The school, but not Ivy's school, his. Ivy looked confused. "Why are we here?" Reagan smiled softly. "Because I need to answer your question." The hallway outside the music room was dim and quiet. Just the soft hum of rain hitting the windows and the low creak of an old building breathing in stormy air. Gabe sat at the piano playing a slow, familiar melody. It was the lullaby from Ivy's music box, simple, imperfect, but steady. He stopped when he saw them. "You're early," he said. Reagan stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "Actually, we're late." "To what?" She looked at Ivy, then back at Gabe. "To something I should have asked a long time ago." Gabe stood uncertain. Reagan swallowed hard. "Would you come to dinner with us? Not to talk about Ivy, not to fix anything, just to eat, to be." Gabe blinked. "You're inviting the janitor. I'm inviting the man who taught my daughter how to be brave, and taught me how to unlearn everything that made me hard." He didn't answer right away. Then finally a quiet, "Okay." Dinner was slow, casual, clumsy in all the right ways. Gabe sat at the table like he'd always belonged there. Ivy chatted more than usual small things, school, a new song she was learning, the raccoon that lived in the tree outside her classroom. Gabe listened. Reagan watched. And for once no one filled the pauses with noise. After Ivy went to bed, Reagan walked Gabe to the door. She hesitated, then said, "She asked me today if I was happy." Gabe turned, and I didn't know what to say. He nodded slowly. "But I realized something while we were eating," she continued. "I used to think happiness was about achievement, about control. Now, I think it's just about choosing people who feel like silence you don't need to fill." He smiled. "That's beautiful." "It's true." They stood in the quiet. Then Gabe asked, "And do I feel like that kind of silence?" Reagan met his gaze. "You are that kind of silence." As he stepped out into the drizzle, she called after him. "Gabe." He turned. "If I asked you to try again, not as a therapist, but as a man, would you?" He paused, then said, "Only if you promise not to fix me." "I won't." "Then yes." And with that he walked into the rain, not as the janitor, but as a man finally walking toward something, not away from it. Upstairs, Ivy lay awake in bed. She watched the rain run down her window and whispered to the dark, "Please, let this be real." And from the hallway, Reagan's voice answered back, soft, steady, "It already is." In a world built on noise, they had all learned to listen again. And that was how happiness began. The first time Gabe Blake stepped back into a classroom, it was without a degree, without a license, and without expectation. But this time, he wasn't standing at a podium or holding a clipboard. He was sitting on the floor, legs crossed next to a half-circle of children who had learned to trust him not because of his title, but because of his presence. And right beside him in a tiny folding chair labeled assistant sat Ivy, pencil behind her ear, clipboard in her lap, tiny shoes swinging above the tile. She wasn't just helping, she was co-leading. Reagan leaned quietly in the doorway watching them through the glass. There was no spotlight in this room, no applause, just small voices trying to make sense of big feelings. A little boy was struggling to pronounce his name. Gabe leaned in and said gently, "Say it like it's a secret you're letting me in on." The boy smiled. "Try it again." "Got it right." The kids clapped. But it was Ivy who whispered just loud enough for her mom to hear, "That's what it feels like to be heard." After the session, the principal stopped Reagan in the hallway. "I wasn't sure about this idea at first," he admitted. "But whatever you and Mr. Blake have built, it's working. The kids adore him." Reagan nodded. "It's not what he does, it's how he sees them." The principal tilted his head. "Do you think he'll want to formalize it? We'd support a part-time therapeutic program if he was open to it." Reagan smiled. "I think he will, but not because of the title. Then why? She glanced into the room again, because he finally believes he still has something to give. That evening, Gabe stood outside Reagan's apartment holding something wrapped in brown paper and string. His hands were unusually fidgety, his voice quiet when she opened the door. "This is for Ivy," he said. Reagan took it gently. "What is it?" "Something old. I thought she might want to make hers." Inside was a notebook, well-worn, leather-bound, with hand-sketched music notes along the edges of each page. She used to play pieces of it, he said, without knowing they were mine. Reagan ran her fingers over the faded pages. "It's your wife's, isn't it?" He nodded. It's the last thing she wrote in before her voice went. Reagan looked at him surprised. "You're giving this away." "I'm not," he said softly. "I'm passing it on." Later that night, Ivy sat on the living room rug, the notebook open in front of her. Gabe sat beside her, showing her how to read the scrawled annotations, the markings only a trained ear would recognize. Reagan watched from the couch, then said quietly, "I've spent years convincing judges that words matter. But lately, I think how we use them matters more than anything." Gabe looked up. "Words are like songs. They're not supposed to impress, they're supposed to connect." Reagan nodded. "And silence isn't the enemy, is it?" "No," he said. "It's the canvas." As Ivy fell asleep later that night, the music notebook tucked beside her pillow, Reagan stood at her bedroom door, arms crossed, heart full. "She's not afraid of her own voice anymore," she whispered. Gabe stepped beside her. Because someone taught her it was worth hearing. Reagan looked at him. "And you're not afraid to give yours again." He gave a slow smile. Because someone stayed long enough to listen. The following week, Gabe's Story Through Sound pilot program launched at Bellhurst. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no media, just 10 children, 2 old instruments, 1 music box on the piano, and a chalkboard that read, "Tell it how you feel it, even if it's quiet." Reagan sat in the back of the room during the first session. She wasn't there to supervise, she was there to witness. And as Ivy helped a new student find her first note on the keyboard, Reagan felt something settle in her chest, something steady. Whole. She glanced at Gabe. He met her eyes. No words passed between them, but the message was unmistakable. This is the life we didn't know we could still build. That night, under soft lamplight and worn couches, Reagan asked Gabe a question. If you could go back and rewrite your story before all the silence, the pain, the loss, would you? Gabe thought for a long moment, then said no. Reagan raised an eyebrow. Why not? Because if I'd changed any page, he said, voice low and steady. I might have missed the chapter where you walked in. Outside, the city was quiet. Inside, a home no longer built on silence was learning to sing. The auditorium hummed with low chatter, the kind of excited noise that fills a room before something meaningful begins. Folding chairs lined the polished wooden floor. Stage lights warmed the red velvet curtain. Parents leaned forward. Teachers held their breath. It was the end-of-year ceremony at Bellhurst Academy. But for one little girl, sitting near the front row, feet swinging nervously in shiny black shoes, this wasn't just a ceremony. It was a beginning. Backstage, Ivy clutched a folded piece of paper in her hands. Her fingers trembled slightly, not out of fear but something deeper, readiness. Gabe crouched beside her, his tie slightly crooked, his presence calm. You don't have to read it all, he said gently, just the parts that feel true today. Ivy looked up at him. But what if I forget? Then speak from where it still lives inside you, he said. That's where the best words come from. She nodded, then turned to her mother, who had just arrived backstage with a soft smile and eyes that already shimmered. Mom. Ivy said, her voice small but sure. Will you be where I can see you? Reagan knelt down to meet her daughter's eyes. I'll be front row. I'll never not be where you can see me again. On stage, the principal welcomed the crowd, thanked the staff, praised the achievements. Polite applause followed. Then came the final announcement. This year, for the first time, our closing speech will be delivered by a student. One whose journey has reminded us that finding your voice doesn't mean speaking the loudest. It means speaking when it matters. A hush fell over the room, and now… Ivy Moore. Ivy stepped into the light. For a second, the room held its breath. She scanned the crowd, found her mother in the front row, found Gabe standing in the wing. Then, unfolding the crinkled paper in her hands, she began. "Hi, I'm Ivy. I used to be quiet. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I didn't know if anyone wanted to hear it. Then, someone did. He was the janitor. He had old shoes and a soft way of sitting with silence like it was a friend. He didn't ask me to speak, he just stayed, and somehow that made me want to. The room was still now. You could have heard a pencil drop. My mom is here too. She's a lawyer, a very good one. For a while I thought she only listened in court, but now she listens in the car, at bedtime, in the quiet. She tells me stories she never used to say, and sometimes when she doesn't know what to say, she just holds my hand. That's even better. I learned that voices are like music. They don't all sound the same. Some are loud, some are soft, some don't come out for a long time, but when they do, they deserve a place to land. Thank you to Mr. Gabe for giving my voice a place to land. And thank you to my mom for giving it a place to grow. I'm not afraid to speak anymore, because now I know I don't have to be perfect, I just have to be me." The room rose in silence. Then came the applause. Not wild or thunderous, but slow, reverent, like everyone was trying not to break the spell she had just woven. Gabe wiped at his eyes, not bothering to pretend he wasn't crying. Reagan stood, hands clasped her smile, breaking with pride and wonder. Ivy bowed shyly, then ran off stage and straight into Gabe's arms. "You did it," he whispered. "You said I would," she replied. Reagan joined them, pulling her daughter into her arms. "You didn't just speak, sweetheart. You moved an entire room." Ivy looked between them both. "Can we go get pancakes now?" Gabe laughed. "Now that's a proper ending." Outside, the summer air was golden, soft, free. They walked toward the parking lot together, hand in hand, Reagan, Ivy, and Gabe, like a melody finally finding its harmony. There were no speeches now, no ceremony, just the kind of silence you keep when your heart is too full for anything else. Then, as they reached the car, Ivy looked up and asked, "Are we a story?" Reagan smiled. "We're the story," Gabe added, "and the best part is, we're still writing it. Some stories begin with a voice. Others begin with silence. But the ones we remember forever are the ones where someone finally listened. The end. Or maybe just the beginning. And that was the janitor who knew her voice before she spoke. A story about silence healing and the quiet strength it takes to truly listen. Now, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? And what part of this story touched your heart the most? Was it Ivy's first words? Gabe's quiet wisdom? Or Reagan's journey to becoming more than strong, becoming present? Let us know in the comments. Your thoughts help us create stories that matter. And if you'd like more powerful healing stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon so you never miss a new episode. And most importantly, share this video with someone who needs a little hope today. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. We see you, we hear you, and we're honored to tell these stories for you. Until next time, take care and keep listening.